Epilogue. Many of Remember's hopes and dreams came true. Others did not. She never again saw her dear friend Humility Sawyer, and Mem's and Hannah's plans for peas and a bigger garden did not succeed, nor did the dreams of an abundant crop come true for the rest of the settlement. In 1628, when Mem was 19 years old, she married William Endicott. In 1630, the city of Boston was founded, and Mem and her husband moved there along with others who realized that their destiny was not to try and tame the back-breaking, rock-strewn New England soil. Soon after, Mem gave birth to twin girls, whom she named Humility and Grace. Her husband William became a successful merchant of dried fish and soon branched out into lumbering. Many others from the original Plymouth settlement found their way to Boston, including Blessing, who married a cousin of William Endicott's, and finally Hannah came as a widow when Mem's father died. Mem and Hannah and Mem's twins, along with Blessing and Hannah's two young sons by Mem's father, baked hardtack and sea biscuits for the larders of ships in the merchant's trade. But they also baked cinnamon buns and Hannah Potts Whipple's special ginger cake, which could not go to sea, but became famous in many homes. Remember, Patience Whipple lived a very long life, so long that the best dream of all was fulfilled. She lived to see her children's children's children, and in fact it was a great-great-great-granddaughter, a Miss Humility Albright, who discovered the diary of Remember Patience Whipple Endicott in a trunk blackened with age in the attic of her parents' house on Beacon Hill in Boston in the year 1850. Historical note. In 1620, the Pilgrims sailed to America in order to escape religious and political persecution and to establish a settlement where they could live and worship in a way that they defined as godly. In their native England under King James' first reign, the Church of England was very powerful. Anyone who did not follow the established religion or cooperate with the king's wishes faced persecution in the form of arrests, imprisonment, fines, and other types of official harassment. A group of reformers called Puritans questioned the church's power, and a faction of them began to condemn the church as corrupt and unlawful. They then were scorned by the king because their questioning threatened his authority as well as that of the church. Some of them began to meet in secret. They were known as the Separatists because they wanted to separate themselves completely from the church. When the king found out about their meetings, some Separatists were sentenced to jail. 2 had already been hanged. In 1607, a group of them decided that they could no longer live in a country where the practice of religion was forced on people under threats of arrest. For fear of their livelihoods as well as their lives, the Separatists decided to move to Leyden, Holland, where they could worship freely. But life in Holland was hard economically, and they felt extremely isolated in this new land. They were also worried that their children would forget how to speak English or become soldiers and sailors for Holland, and would forget how to speak English, or they would become soldiers and sailors for Holland. They decided to emigrate to the New World. The Separatists became known as the Pilgrims. They were led by the wise elder William Brewster and an idealistic young man named William Bradford. The Pilgrims knew that another English colony had already been established in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and they were ready to create their own colony in northern Virginia. They were able to convince some London businessmen, the merchant adventurers, to sponsor their voyage. In return for financial backing by the London group, the Pilgrims promised to work for the next 7 years to pay off their debts. Essentially, they would be indentured servants to this coalition of merchants who hoped to accumulate a great profit from their chartered colony. The Pilgrims returned to England, where they were provided with a small wooden ship named the Mayflower and some supplies to help them survive their first months in the wilds of the Americas. On Wednesday, September 6, 1620, 102 brave people, including 34 children, crowded onto the ship and set off to form a colony of their own. About 35 of them were going for religious reasons. They were the Pilgrims, though they preferred to be called the Saints. Others, because they couldn't find work in England, and still others for the spirit of adventure. The journey was long and difficult. There was little to eat except the salted beef and pork, dry biscuits, and also some cheese, peas, and beans from Holland. But food spoiled quickly, and the barreled water was not safe to drink. Many of the passengers were terribly seasick, and 2, including 1 sailor, died during the grueling trip. After more than 2 months, the Pilgrims arrived on what is now Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Since they had been planning to settle in Virginia colony, it was clear that they had gone more than a little off course. Cape Cod looked to be a rocky, ominous land. After determining to explore further, the Pilgrims sailed inland to the more welcoming shores of Plymouth, which had been discovered and named 6 years earlier by Captain John Smith. On December 21, 1620, the Pilgrims finally stepped ashore. No one is quite sure whether any of the Pilgrims actually stepped on the rock, now known as Plymouth Rock, but many people believe the legend developed because it was the only good landing place along 2.5 miles of beach. The first few months of Plymouth were cold and harsh for the new immigrants. Coming to this foreign land in the dead of winter was probably not the best plan. The Pilgrims arrived with no shelter, no medical care, and very few provisions. And because they still had to build houses, many of them spent most of their winter living aboard the ship. Illness swept through the tiny community, and more than half the Pilgrims died during the first winter. Some were killed by starvation and scurvy, while others died from pneumonia, fevers, and other diseases. While the Pilgrims did use medical herbs, there was no medicine that could cure the ravaging diseases that were killing them. Many doctors believed in bleeding ill patients, opening a vein to let some quote-unquote poisoned blood flow out. The Pilgrims had agreed to elect a man named John Carver to be their first governor, but he did not survive the long winter. William Bradford was elected to take his place. He and the other leaders of the group created a document called the Mayflower Compact, signed by all of the men in the small colony. In it, they agreed to hold annual elections for a governor and assistants who would draft fair laws for all to follow. While America's struggle for independence was over 150 years away, the early seeds of self-government were sown by the forward-thinking Pilgrims. The Plymouth colonists came in almost immediate contact with the Indian people. Some of the local tribes, like the various Wampanoag groups, were friendly towards the Pilgrims. The Wampanoag had been trading furs with Europeans for years before the Mayflower landed, but the Pilgrims were the first Europeans to settle permanently on Wampanoag land. On March 16, 1621, 3 months after their arrival, the Pilgrims met an Abenaki Indian named Samoset, who spoke English and told them about their neighboring Indian tribes. He also introduced them to another named Tisquatom and Squanto, the only surviving Patatux native of Plymouth. He became their dearest friend and stayed with the Pilgrims for the rest of his life. When spring came and the Pilgrims were able to plant their first crops, Squanto introduced them to maize, or Indian corn. He also taught the Pilgrims how to fish and where to hunt for deer and turkey. While some of the English crops like beans and wheat did not grow very well in the rocky New England soil, maize thrived. The Pilgrims traded their surplus corn to the Indians for beaver pelts. These furs were then sent to England to help pay off their debts. There were other tribes, like the Gayhead and the Narragansetts, and they were also not as welcoming as the Pilgrims, and Captain Miles Standish helped from a military, providing self-defense for the fledgling community. That October, the surviving Pilgrims, about 50, celebrated the first Thanksgiving. It lasted 3 days, and they invited members of the Wampanoag tribe to join them for the joyful feast. They ate wild turkey, deer, meat pies, duck, fresh fish, vegetables from the Pilgrims' gardens, corn, and wild berries. The Pilgrims had much to be thankful for. Without the help of Squanto and their Indian neighbors, they would not have survived their first year. They also signed an official peace treaty with the Wampanoag chief. Later, the British would take advantage of the Pilgrims' new allies and force them to move away from their ancestral lands, but this did not happen initially. For the next few years, the Pilgrims were almost isolated in their new settlement. The population grew slowly, as every so often ships would arrive from England with some new immigrants. For the most part, though, the Pilgrims were on their own. The Company of London never made a profit from the Pilgrims. It was too hard to exert control over colonies that were so far away. Plymouth was now essentially independent, although the King of England still had the final jurisdiction over the activities. In practice, the Pilgrims were a self-governing community, but their fight for independence was only just beginning.